A very warm welcome to all of you to this session on aspects of herd behavior. I'm Manaswini Bhalla and I'm an associate professor at IIM Bangalore. And I'm very happy to talk to you about herd behavior in this edition of South Asian University Economic Development Conference 2021. Let me lay out how the session is planned out. I'll begin by discussing what are information cascades, what is herd behavior. Then I'll go on and talk to you about a very seminal paper called A Simple Model of Herd Behavior by Abhijit Banerjee. Then I'll tell you how I have used this herd behavior work in two of my papers very briefly. So let's begin. Let's talk about what is herd behavior. Before I start and discuss what this notion of herd behavior is, let me ask you a few questions. Why do you think some products become more popular, some ideas become more popular than usual? Why do they become viral? Is it always that the quality of the product is good? Could there be something else? What are the reasons for fashions and fads? In other words, why do blind leaders of the blind lead them to the ditch? Could it be because there's some pressure to perform, to conform? If you don't conform in a particular fashion, there's likelihood of there being sanctions. Or could there be another reason, which is that as the number of consumers who consume the product increases, it increases the benefit of consuming that product, which is called payoff externalities. However, we are interested in something else. We're trying to ask, could there be reasons related to the informational aspects of decision making that could lead to herd mentality? Could the herd mentality be explained more rationally? Rationally, Vichandani, Hirschleifer, and Welch, in their paper, define and coin a term called informational cascades, which is a phenomena which is of where a rational decision, who's socially learning from the actions of the ones above him, decides to disregard his own or her own private information and follow the ones who come above him. Essentially saying that because of this tendency to learn from others above you who have acted before you, you may end up disregarding your own private information, which may be actually correct, and end up in a herd mentality. Let me try and explain this using um, an example from the paper of Abhijit Banerjee 1992, a simple model of herd behavior. Assume that there is a very new restaurant which has just opened up across the corner, and you have to decide whether to dine there or not. The state of the world is the quality of the restaurant, which could either be good or bad, and the likelihood of the state of the world being good or bad, or the restaurant being good or bad, is half. In each period, there is one diner who enters the market. He inspects the good. Basically, he tastes. He doesn't go and buy. He doesn't go and dine there. He just gets a taster. This taster also could either be good or bad, and it is a private signal. He doesn't disclose this to anybody else, and it's independently drawn from each other. This helps him update his belief about the underlying state of the world, which is the state of the, which is the state of the nature of the restaurant. Now we give they give a structure to the signal, which is to say that the likelihood of you getting a correct signal is lambda, which is to say the state of the world is bad. What is the likelihood of you getting a bad signal? If the state of the world is good, what's the likelihood of you getting a good signal? That's lambda, which is essentially the precision of the individual. And this precision of the individual is assumed to be greater than half, which is to say that your signals are informative. They have some information out there. Utilities are modeled in the following fashion. If you don't dine in the restaurant, you get zero. But if you dine in the restaurant, you get a positive utility only if the state of the world is good, and you get a negative utility if the state of the world is bad. What do you do? What does the first consumer do? He draws a signal, which is going to be either good or bad, updates his belief about the underlying state of the world, which is G or bad, good or bad, and using Bayes' rule. We all know that the state of the world, that the good, the likelihood of the state of the world being good given that you received a good signal can be used using Bayes' rule, knowing that your precision, which is the what is likely to be getting a correct signal, is lambda. So, as individual, a first consumer who gets a good signal will update the state of the world, likelihood of the state of the world being good to lambda, and will end up therefore dining, given that a lambda is greater than half. And how do we know that? Let me explain that to you using the expected utility. Your decision to consume or not to consume depends upon comparing your expected utility of not consuming, which is zero, to that of when you do consume or do dine. And that's just essentially saying that the utility that you get from dining, given the state is state dependent, and multiply to that utility the likelihood of the state that you are considering, conditional on the signal that you have received. And that just tantamount to saying that if your updated belief about the state of the world being good is greater than half, you will end up consuming, and it ends up being greater than half only when you, as a first individual, as a first consumer, would have received a good signal. So the first consumer, if he consumes his state of the signal, his updated belief about the state of the world is lambda, and it's greater than half, and hence he consumes, and therefore his act of dining perfectly reveals his state, his signal. If he doesn't consume, that just essentially means that it had received a bad signal. Now, what is the what does a second consumer observe, or how does he take a decision? It observes its own signal, it draws its own signal, and also observes the action of the first individual. The action of the first individual, as I just mentioned, perfectly reveals the private signal of the individual. So if the consumer has dined, he has received a good signal, and bad and if he doesn't dine, that essentially means that it had received a bad signal. So the second mover updates its belief about the state of the world conditional on the signal that it receives and the action that it observes. And the action that it observes is completely informative about the signal of the individual in the first who moves first. And it updates its belief, and the decision ends up coming to the following. It says that if the updated belief about the state of the world, given the two signals that you have received, because the second individual essentially receives two signals, its own and the one that it observes perfectly. If it is more than half, then you will consume, otherwise you will not. And then, as you know, when each there are two individuals and two of them will have two signals, then essentially like four possibilities out there. And the updated beliefs are kind of very simple to get. If the two individuals get different signals, then essentially they cancel out, and you're back to the square one, which is your initial prior, which is half, the likelihood of the state being the state of the world being good being half, and the tie breaking rule basically says that in such a case, when you are indifferent, you will end up following this signal that you have received. However, if you both received the same signal, that's first and second you see the good signal, and the first and second you see the bad signal, then you are just your signal is just adding on to what you have observed from the other, and hence you're collecting more information of the same kind, and hence you will act according to your signal itself. Here, therefore, in the second consumer, by the second consumer, you don't really get much information. You don't really see information cascades creeping in. It's only in the third consumer in this model that you actually see there is some evidence for information cascades trickling in. And how does the third consumer take a decision? It observes its own signal and observes the action of the people above him, the first player and the second player. And the first player's actions are completely revealing of his signal, and so is the case for the second mover. So essentially, the decision of the third mover comes down to the following, which is that if given the three signals that you have observed, if the updated belief about the state of the world is good, then it turns out if that object, which is the updated belief about the state of the world being good, given that you receive three signals, is more than half, then the diner will dine. Okay, so basically, if you have sufficient evidence to say that the good state is good, then you will dine. So let's look at that object more closely. You have three signals here, and they could in 2 raised to power 3 possibilities that can happen. Now assume that but most and you can very easily do the use Bayes rule and this and fill in the blanks here. But let me explain to you the interesting part which happens, which is that if the state one, if the signals received by the first and the second individual is the same, it's only here that you find some evidence for information cascades beginning. For example, let's assume that the first and the second got good signal, and the third individual also got a good signal. Well, it's again reinforcing the information that is around there, and hence you will find that the consumer's updated belief about the restaurant being of good type is greater than half, and he or she will end up consuming. So yeah, there's no hurt behavior there. However, if you observed that the first and the second individual got a good signal and you as the third individual got a bad signal, your updated belief will essentially be lambda, which is that the you can think that you have three signals, two good, one bad, and the bad and the good one or the good signal cancels out, and it's essentially just one signal that ends up ruling the decision making, and we know that if that's the case, then the updated belief about the state of the world being good, given that you have one good signal, is lambda, and that's greater than half. And if that's the case, you will end up consuming. So what are you finding is that if the people above you have good signals, two of them, even though you have a bad signal, you will end up consuming. Similarly, is the case when if your two individuals have got a bad signal, but if you have got a good signal, you will disregard your own private information, and your updated belief would be such that the updated state of the world is good, and you will be 1 minus lambda, which is less than half, and you will not consume. So here are two possible ways in which herd behavior information cascades can begin to arise. What do Big Chandani, Hirschleifer and Welch and Banerjee find in their own respective papers? They say that the probability of cascade tends to goes to 1, and it increases as signals become more accurate. These cascades, information cascades, are extremely fragile, which means that slight change in information or information and things will start changing. If they are highly path dependent, it depends upon the signals that are received. And yes, they can go wrong, which is to say that if, let's say, the restaurant was actually good, but first two individuals got a bad signal, the third individual will disregard its own private information, no matter whether it has got a good signal or not. And in the end, the restaurant will not pick up. So bad news, or what we call as downturn cascades. Now, what are some extensions that have happened? It's very natural to assume that if you to think about the optimal pricing strategy of a firm or firms, when you know that your consumers are behaving or socially learning from each other. This is exactly what Bose et al. Do in the 2008 paper, and then they find that the prices are on an average decreasing. Another natural question to ask is what would be the optimal trials that you should introduce when consumers are socially learning, and that's something which is done by Scroy. Now, in my paper in Journal of Industrial Economics, I combine these two questions and I ask the following: what is the optimal dynamic pricing and launch strategy of a monopolist, where consumers are learning from each other? When the product of the quality is not known, every period the monopolist is deciding the price and the regions, the number of regions to introduce the product, and the prices, and the consumers are inspecting and then deciding whether to consume or not. What we find is that for extreme beliefs, the firm either exits the market or doesn't, or introduces the product simultaneously. Only for intermediate beliefs does the product launch sequentially, and the price sequence is super martingale, which means to say that prices on an average decrease, but the fraction of sales is actually increasing. Let me explain this to you by an example. Let's say there are two regions. There is a monopolist who maximizes his discounted expected profits. Costs are all kind of costs are zero because we only want to look at the role of information, nothing else. Consumers in each region, one consumer has one consumer, and each consumer maximizes expected utility. Both consumers have similar preferences. So there's an uncertain state of the world, which is that whether the product is good or bad, both monopolists and the consumers are unaware about the quality of the product. Work can be done in trying to understand what could be the optimal signaling strategy of a monopolist when the monopolist knows its own quality, but the consumer does not. The initial state of the world is Q naught, and a monopolist decides on the number of regions and the prices of the product. The payoffs are expected per period. Payoffs are standard using discounting factor. Consumers inspect the product, and they can get signals with accuracy which can be high or low, and the accuracy of the signal is lambda, and signals are conditionally independent of each other, and they're private information and absolutely costless. And then knowing this, consumers update the belief about the product's quality. Consumer decides whether to consume or not to consume the product, and the payoffs are very similar. If you don't consume, you get zero. If you consume, you get positive amount only if the state of the world is good, and exactly opposite negative amount if the state of the world is bad. End of the period, the consumers where the product has not been launched update their belief about the state of the world, observing how many regions where the product was launched, what was the price at which it was launched, was there an act of consumption or not, and using last period comment prior, they update the belief about the product's quality. What do we find? We find that for low beliefs, the product is not introduced in any market. For sufficiently high beliefs, the product is launched simultaneously, but only for intermediate beliefs is the product launched sequentially. And the reason is that there is benefit in introducing the product sequentially, so that the belief, so that through experimentation, the belief about the product is actually improved. Something very similar in prices as well, and we on an average we find that prices decline over the period of time. We first want to introduce the product sufficiently at a high price so that the perception about the product improves, such and over the period of time the prices decline. Similarly, prices average sales increase over the time. There's an error that should be average sales should increase over the time. In the other paper, what we do is just published in Journal of Economic Theory. What we do is that we say that in our first paper in my first paper, I'd said that let's look at a case of a monopolist. In this case, we say let's look at a case where there are two firms, and then we say that what is the optimal intertemporal pricing strategy in such a case, and when the products are durable and differentiated, and the consumers are interdependent. What unlike the first paper, here we find that the prices do not decrease over the period of time; they actually, on an average, remain the same if you introduce competition in the market. And you find that the same product is consumed, it's not going to be the same, that only one product is consumed all the period of time. It could and also there is the probability of delay by either consumer decreases as the consumers become more interdependent. Interdependencies actually improves, reduces any kind of delay. Now, there can be a lot of work that can be done in this field, and a lot of work has been done in this field, both empirical and theoretical. Some ideas that I like to throw out just in case if somebody is interested. For example, how do ideas spread? How do ideas spread in a network? What's a good model for Twitter? Why do certain profiles become more popular than the other? What is the interaction between information and ideology, and why do certain people consume certain kind of information alone, and what is the reason for extremism? How do information spread in a network, given that this is the way in which information spreads in the network. What is the optimal marketing campaign? Now, all these are all interesting questions, and I wish all of you, if you are interested in such work, all the good luck, and all the others as well, a lot of good luck. Thank you for having me here. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And if you have any further questions or comments, feel free to shoot an email to me. Thank you.